Hello, and thank you for listening to the Plasma for Life podcast series brought to you by RFN Studios. If you'd like to learn more, visit www.plasmaforlife.org and follow our social media. Account links can be found on our website. I wanted to bring multiple perspectives to this discussion, even if they may differ from my own personal opinion. I came across a paper with a very unique perspective written by Vida Panitch and L. Chad Horn. So I reached out, and Vida was kind enough to give us an interview. I'm here with Vida Panitch, and she is the Associate Professor of Philosophy, Ethics, and Public Affairs at Carleton University. And the reason I reached out to Vida is that her and Chad Horn wrote a very interesting article called Paying for Plasma, Commodification, Exploitation, and Canada's Plasma Shortage.
I think that the Canadian debate has focused largely on this question about whether it's ethical to pay plasma donors. My co-author and I, Chad Horn and I, think that the way that we answer that question about whether it's ethical or not largely depends on who is paying them. And there has been too little discussion about where that payment is coming from and too much discussion about whether there should be a payment at all. And so we think that we need to shift the focus of the debate towards whether or not the payment should be coming effectively from a for-profit agency or a not-for-profit agency.
In the debate over paying for plasma, we often see a lot of yes versus no, black or white thinking, and as a patient, I was happy to hear that someone was looking in the gray.
So it's not so much that we need to keep a voluntary whole blood system distinct from a for-profit paid plasma acquisition system, because I think that we can have a not-for-profit paid plasma acquisition system that would be consistent with voluntary whole blood donations. The model that we are recommending in the paper is one where instead of licensing for-profit agencies like Canadian Plasma Resources, we would rather see CBS increase plasma donation by offering payment as a form of incentivization. And as it stands, we don't need to do that for whole blood because we are meeting our requirements. But we're not meeting our requirements for plasma, and there's many studies have shown that some form of compensation, but typically cash, is effective as a way of incentivizing, of increasing plasma donations. So the model we're advocating is one that would see CBS take over the role of compensating plasma donors as a way of increasing supply.
When I first learned about the plasma shortage, I had similar feeling and even reached out to CBS, asking them to start paying plasma donors to solve this problem. Unfortunately, they still to this day refuse, despite acknowledging that paid plasma is just as safe as unpaid plasma for the manufacture of therapies like immunoglobulin.
We're not advocating for any kind of for-profit model. We wouldn't want to see any more for-profit agencies getting licenses to open more clinics where they would be paying donors. We would rather see CBS take over that role. One of the advantages of having a not-for-profit agency like CBS paying donors is fundamentally about ensuring that the plasma that's collected in Canada will stay in Canada. So if CBS is controlling plasma acquisition and increasing plasma acquisition through payment, then controlling the supply that it acquires, it will not have an incentive to sell the plasma acquired in Canada to the highest bidder, which might be somewhere else, right? So if we have a not-for-profit agency like CBS in charge of plasma acquisition here through payment, we can be certain that CBS will use the plasma that it acquires in Canada to treat the needs of Canadian patients.
This is where my opinion differs with Vida and Chad's. I don't believe private paid plasma collection companies are the boogeyman that they are made out to be, but I was willing to listen.
Fundamentally, if our concern is about the security of our own supply, then having a for-profit agency paying donors is a bad model, because they're going to be inclined to sell that plasma to whomever is going to offer them the most money for it, Whereas a not-for-profit agency like CBS is accountable not just to shareholders, it's accountable to Canadian stakeholders. And so its mandate is to increase and protect the security of our plasma supply. And as such, it would have a mandate to keep Canadian plasma in Canada.
This does make sense on the surface. However, one factor that is often overlooked is that Canada, with one large national contract and a public healthcare system, has substantial buying power in the international plasma market, arguably more than the US, whose citizens provide most of the global supply. We saw this in how the shortage of 2019 was even more of a hardship for American patients. And in terms of public accountability for Canadian Blood Services, I feel it falls short.
Now, as a patient who's been affected by the shortage, I would have to say that Canadian Blood Services, although they are accountable to their board of trustees and the public and so forth, I would say that they have failed in a sense that they have known that there was a drastic projected increase in the need for plasma, specifically immunoglobulin products. And they are the only ones exempt from the Voluntary Blood Donations Act. And yet still to this day, they absolutely refuse to pay for plasma. I would say Canadian Blood Services, if you're not going to pay donors for plasma, step aside and let someone do it who will.
Fair enough. So, two things. I mean, what Chad and I are advocating for in the paper is a not-for-profit agency like CBS. So our argument is not specific to CBS, which is one of the reasons that we opposed the bill that you're referring to, is that why should it have to just be CBS? If they're going to refuse to do it, why can't another not-for-profit agency step in and fill that role? So I agree with you in that respect, that we should leave the door open if CBS is going to refuse to do it, for the possibility of another not-for-profit agency doing it, rather than simply throwing our hands in the air and saying, well, then let's just let private agencies come in and address this issue, because I think that that's not going to resolve the security concern.
This could be a viable solution, but unfortunately, the Voluntary Blood Donations Act prohibits any person from providing payment to blood or plasma donors, and also prohibits any donor from accepting payment. The only exemption is for Canadian Blood Services themselves, or for the purpose of research. So this proposed solution is not even a possibility under the Voluntary Blood Donations Act, and this has only hurt patients. With the solution proposed by CBS, they only aim to achieve 50% self-sufficiency. To quote Peter Jaworski from our last interview, "What do I think about Canadian Blood Services only aiming for 50% self-sufficiency? I think that's just not good enough." I expressed my concerns to Vida, and this is what she had to say.
Obviously, we have good reason to want to be more sufficient in our plasma supply. Issues of shortages are significant, and we have a lot of Canadian citizens, a lot of Canadian patients who depend on various kinds of plasma-derived medicinal products. We are relying very heavily on paid plasma that we're purchasing from the United States, and for all sorts of reasons, that supply chain could get interrupted. American suppliers could choose to sell to somebody else, and we have really no control over that. So even if we achieve 50% self-sufficiency, we're still 50% of our need is still at the mercy of an international market. This really is a matter of life and death for many Canadian patients. I think we have a good reason to want to have a more secure supply to a far greater extent than 50%. Obviously, CBS should be accountable to taxpayers, right? And so if they are investing tax dollars in far less effective methods, right? Methods that are expensive and ineffective with respect to the goal of increasing our supply of plasma, then yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be some accountability there, and they should be expected to, engage in practices that are more effective, provided those practices are ethical. And I certainly think that paying plasma donors is ethical. And so that's the aim of the paper, was to try to suggest, look, these ethical concerns are overblown. So we shouldn't be discrediting this as a means by which to increase our supply, because these ethical worries aren't the right ones. Beyond that, I mean, comparing what's more or less ethical, whether CBS is not being properly accountable to taxpayers by investing in these ineffective strategies, whether that's less ethical than Canadian Plasma Resources like profiting from, or having their shareholders like profit from the blood of, the plasma of Canadian citizens. I don't know how to answer the kind of more or less question. I would say, with a particular goal in mind of increasing our plasma supply, right? Which of these two strategies is the more effective one with respect to that goal? And if we can be certain that a for-profit agency won't wind up selling Canadian plasma, to the highest bidder, then I'm not as worried about for-profit agencies paying donors. I just think that if our objective is indeed the security of our own supply, then I worry that for-profit agencies aren't committed to that goal in the same way that a not-for-profit agency that would be accountable, right, to public stakeholders would be committed to that goal. But you're absolutely right that the way that the choices that CBS is making seem to suggest that perhaps they're not that committed to that goal because they are choosing less effective strategies than they could be from the point of view of promoting that one important goal.
I want to pause here and say I don't want this negative aspect of Canadian Blood Services operations to overshadow all of the good, vital work that they do, or their volunteers and donors. Do not boycott donating to CBS over this issue. That would be a huge disservice to patients. Get out there and donate blood or plasma if you're able, wherever you can. And now on to the ethics behind the argument.
I'm extremely interested in questions about the commodification of the body and the exploitation of people who sell and donate parts of their body. And I'm very intrigued by the way that those kinds of moral worries get translated into public debate. Exploitation, as a kind of theory that political philosophers are interested in, raises concerns about two kinds of things. And one of them is about, look, if some kind of unfair advantage taking is occurring in an interaction or a transaction, is that unfair advantage taking the result of some kind of fraud or deception? So has one party been forced or manipulated, right, to participate in some kind of exchange that they otherwise would have not chosen to participate in? And the other question that people who talk about exploitation are interested in is this question about injustice and whether both parties are receiving something fair as a result of their interaction or their exchange. So what you asked is whether it is coercive or exploitative to pay donors something around $25 to $50. And I think that answer is sort of a contextual one. So sometimes, for example, like if we're talking about paying for kidneys on the black market in the developing world, and a potential donor or vendor is being offered like $1,500 to $3,000 for a kidney, and they have no other way, given their circumstances, of making that kind of money over the course of the next 3 to 5 years, yes, it's possible that a sum of money can certainly act as a coercive agent on a person's, choice making in a problematically manipulative way. I'm not sure in the Canadian context that $25 does that. Of course, there is poverty and inequality in Canada, and we should certainly be worried about where some of these private for-profit clinics are opening in terms of the disadvantaged neighborhoods that they're opening in. Against the backdrop of a welfare state, however improper or inadequate we think it might be, I'm not particularly moved by the claim that $25 is so manipulative of a person's incentive structure or choice set that it acts as an offer they simply cannot refuse. Right? And that's what we need to be worrying about when we talk about coercion or manipulation. I don't think that the price here is so high that it's something that a Canadian citizen simply can't refuse. And I don't think we should look at it that way, given the fact that so many Canadians do seem to refuse it, right? There's a lot of vulnerable Canadians who are not selling their plasma to for-profit clinics. So I don't think it's right to characterize the payment in that case as a type of coercive offer that is something that a person simply cannot refuse. As to the distinction you raised about coercion versus incentivization, a helpful way to think about the distinction is that a coercive offer typically limits a person's choice set in such a way that the person extending the offer is trying to diminish the other individual's options, limit the range of their options to the point where the other individual will choose what they want them to. When a gunman, points a gun at your head and says, like, your money or your life, they are now limiting your options. You no longer have the option of keeping your money and your life, right? So they have limited your options in a sense where they're constraining them to the point where you have to choose what they want you to choose, which is to give over your money. An incentive, on the other hand, increases the range of options that you have. So an incentive adds to the range of options you otherwise already had. And a good incentive is one that suddenly makes the offer look better than the other options you previously had. So for an incentive to work, it has to suddenly look like a more desirable option than the other options you previously had available to you. So I would suggest that an offer of $25 of payment is an incentive in the sense that, it's suddenly an option that people may have not have had before, and increases an option set without removing any other kind of option in a coercive way, simply adding to an option set. And if the individual in question, decides that this option now looks more attractive than the other options she previously had available, then the incentive has simply worked, right? Without anybody removing options that she previously had before in a coercive way. But another way that we can talk about exploitation is in a more structural sense. So are we stuck in an unjust structure that makes us particularly vulnerable to unfair advantage taking? This is the political philosopher's response, and so I just have to own it. But I think we have a problem of income inequality in Canada. I think we have an inadequate welfare state. I think wealth is improperly distributed. And I think that's like a larger problem we need to tackle. So if we're worried about the choices that poor Canadians are forced to make, then I don't think that that's actually a conversation about paying plasma donors at all. I think that's a conversation about structural inequalities that we have more of an obligation to be discussing in our national debates. This isn't to say that it isn't worth having this conversation within the realm of whether or not to compensate plasma donors. But I think what it points to is a larger conversation we definitely need to be having about why there are Canadians who, if this is a coercive offer, if this is an offer that certain Canadians can't refuse, then what is it about the Canadian system that makes it such?
Vida offers some very strong points, and we went on to discuss the issue of altruism. And we both believe that there is an unjust stigma around being paid for donating plasma.
One of the things that comes up in the Canadian context all the time, though, and this frustrates me, is that if an incentive works, then somebody is somehow morally blameworthy. That is, they haven't done it purely out of the goodness of their heart. Rather, they have been incentivized and have responded to that incentive, and responding to incentives is sometimes characterized as selfish in the sense of non-altruistic, right? So that if you're doing something because there's something in it for you, then somehow you're acting in accordance with selfish motives, purely selfish motives. And that has been, I think, way too large a part of the debate in Canada, in the sense that the motives of donors are coming under the microscope. Are these the most desperate, vulnerable Canadians that are being targeted? Well, no, it doesn't sound like it. Like, not everybody's doing it because they can't keep the lights on otherwise. So I think that's an important thing to point out, going back to this point about altruism, and that we have this misconception that if somebody does something for money, that they're somehow acting on selfish motives. And we only seem to have this misconception when it comes to the human body, that somehow if you accept payment as a surrogate or a gamete donor or a blood donor, that somehow you're doing something that you should be doing purely altruistically. You're doing it for selfish motives because you want the money. But altruism can coexist with doing something for the money. That is, you recognize that you're doing something noble and helpful and valuable for society, but you also are happy to accept payment because, right, it enables you to address other things in your life. So it might be entirely the case that people who donate to Canadian Plasma Resources are doing it because they want to take better care of their kids or their partners or their aging parents, or, right? So they may need the money, not just to keep the lights on, but to show a better quality of life to people that they care for, or to give gifts to people that they care for. So there may still be an altruistic impulse in seeking out that payment. So to treat the acceptance of that payment as though it's indicative of a purely selfish motivational structure doesn't seem quite right? Lots of people do things for money, but nonetheless also do it because they think it's adding value to the world or engaging in a noble activity. Lots of doctors we think of as doing quite noble work, but they also certainly wouldn't do it without a paycheck, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea that somehow receiving money eclipses altruistic motivations just has always puzzled me as an argument. I think it's one that is voiced a lot without enough kind of critical deconstruction or critical analysis.
Definitely. We don't criticize firefighters and the police officers or nurses, etc.
Exactly. We like, of course we think they should get paid. They're doing such important work. But so like, why doesn't that same thinking apply to people who are donating parts of their body and that are saving other people's lives as a result?
And to these people, whether it's blood, plasma, organs, tissue, eggs, sperm, surrogacy, and so on, thank you. You have literally given a part of yourself so that it can improve the lives of other people. And if you were paid to do so, you deserve every penny. Vida went on to discuss the commodification argument and explores the concept that unpaid donation is perhaps more exploitative than paying donors.
I think that we have a way of talking about the body more broadly as a kind of good that should be exempt from market mechanisms. And so this is why, like in my research, I address questions about surrogacy and gametes, even sex work, because we do have a way of treating the body as the type of good that should be exchanged through non-market mechanisms, that the relations that we stand in with respect to one another's bodies should not be market relations. And I am extremely sympathetic to the thinking and to the motivation for those kinds of worries, but the way that those worries get articulated through policy and legislation has a serious tendency to disadvantage people who are either already disadvantaged, like surrogates in some cases or sex workers in some cases, but it also is a kind of dubious rhetoric when the body is already very much commodified and people are very much profiting from body sales, and then the person whose body it is told that they can't have a share of those profits because the body is too valuable to assign a price. So the way that this argument goes is either, we'll leave aside the question about altruism. The way that this argument goes is usually that there are certain goods that have a certain type of value that is ruined or destroyed when it is evaluated in market terms. So when it's assigned a price, we corrupt the true value of the good in question. And so this makes sense when you're talking about something like friendship, right? If you try to buy a friend, what you get at the end of the transaction actually isn't a friend, it's an employee, right? You've changed the value of the good that you're interested in. And so sometimes these same considerations get applied to thinking about the body, that you are corrupting something about the body's value when you assign it a price, that human beings should be valued beyond price, right? That we have moral worth, that we have a kind of agency or a dignity, and that we can't be reduced to like the price of our body parts or our components. And that's all well and good, except that like people are profiting from industries that trade in the human body. So the people who do transplant surgery make lots of money, right? Mm-hmm. But the people who are giving up their organs for transplant are not allowed to be compensated, even if they've had to take 3 weeks off work or whatever. And the same thing is at issue with respect to the question of plasma, which is there is money being made here, right? There are people who are manufacturing these medicinal products. There are people working at the fractionation facilities that are turning them into these medicinal products, turning plasma into medicinal products. There is money being made from plasma, but the people who are supplying the plasma are being told that what they are supplying is too valuable to have a price. So what worries me is that actually serves as a form of deception that is unjustifiable. So that the individuals who are actually giving up this part of their body are being told, oh no, your body is too valuable to have a price assigned to it. And then immediately after that, further down the supply chain, that part of their body is indeed supplied with a price value, and other people are engaged in market transactions with respect to that body part, as it were. But the supplier of that body part, the person whose body it came from, is told, oh no, it's too valuable to have a price, so we can't give you a share of the profit that is being made for others by the marketization of this part of their own body. And I actually think so on my understanding of exploitation, that would qualify as exploitative because they're being deceived, right? They're being told that your body's too valuable to be commodified, so we're not going to pay you. We're not going to give you a share of the profits that are coming from the fact that we are indeed commodifying your body, and that somebody is indeed very much profiting from it, just not you, the supplier. It's not that I think there aren't indeed certain goods that should maybe be exempt from the market and that maybe should be valued in non-instrumental ways or valued in ways that don't involve assigning it a price. I just think that that's a pretty poor argument for refusing to pay plasma donors, given that plasma is already a commodity, given that we are already paying plasma donors in the US, just strikes me as a wrong-headed argument to be supplying to plasma donors in Canada for why we can't pay them. And not only wrong-headed, but actually deceptive and misleading.
After a great conversation with Vida, we discuss the purpose of her and Chad Horn's paper and how she feels about the topic overall.
So our point is a much more theoretical one, which is just about, if we're thinking about the distinction between for-profit and not-for-profit, then we're thinking about a distinction between who they are answerable to, right? And so just in terms of definition, a for-profit agency is answerable to the shareholders, and a not-for-profit is answerable to citizens and stakeholders in a broader sense. So, oh my gosh, none of this should imply anything about either the individuals in charge of CBS or the individuals in charge of CPR. That is, we are not looking to either castigate, demonize, or elevate any particular set of individuals in charge of any particular organization, right? So although we were talking about CPR and CBS in this paper, what we were trying to do was speak more broadly about what we would like to be able to expect from, or what we should worry about with respect to the motives of different kinds of agencies who might be in charge, right, of plasma acquisition. So philosophers like to speak in extremely broad terms, right? So we were trying to speak more generally about what the distinction is between a for-profit agency and a not-for-profit agency, and why we might have reason to think that a public for-profit agency, not necessarily the one that we currently have, right, but that theoretically a not-for-profit public agency might be a reasonable route to go. And so we needn't worry about paying donors for various ethical reasons if the agency charged with paying them was one that we could rely on to do so ethically. And that was really the only kind of conceptual point we wanted to make in this particular paper, opening the door to further kind of questions. The best thing to keep in mind is what are the strategies that are going to best secure plasma supply in Canada? And I think both for-profit, not-for-profit, public, private agencies need to be evaluated on the basis of both what they're doing now and what the potential risks are of them, continuing a particular strategy down the road vis-a-vis the security of the supply chain. I agree that perhaps CBS is not making the best decisions now, but I ultimately do think that a public agency could be held more accountable than a private industry, and that leads me to think that, at least in a theoretical sense, I would rather see a public agency in charge of plasma acquisition in Canada, precisely because I think there's less risk of our plasma supply winding up somewhere else rather than in the hands of Canadians who need it. The fact that we're paying for plasma already immediately undercuts a whole host of the arguments that typically get trotted out in these debates. So oh, it's wrong to commodify blood, or oh, it's exploitative. If those things are true, then we are already doing it, right? It's just that we're doing it to Americans rather than to Canadians. But I don't think we can pretend that our unpaid system is a virtuous one with respect to exploitation and commodification, because if we're worried about those things, then we're already doing it. We're just doing it to people south of the border rather than north of the border, and I think that's a morally arbitrary distinction. So from that point of view, I don't think that a lot of the arguments that typically get trotted out against payment really hold a lot of water. Do I think that because they are coming from for-profit agencies south of the border, that there is any risk to having a for-profit agency engaged in plasma acquisition here? I mean, the thing that Chad and I were trying to do in this paper was simply to try to carve out some conceptual space to draw a distinction between paying for plasma and profiting from plasma. So to try to draw a distinction between the kinds of things that people might be worried about. The kinds of things that people typically seem to be worried about, like exploitation and commodification when you're paying donors, these are not really the right things to be worried about, because if they are, then we're already doing it, right? So there might be this other set of worries that are actually going on here when people are kind of resistant to licensing more Canadian Plasma Resources clinics. One of the things they might be resistant to is precisely this worry that somebody should be profiting from Canadian plasma. I think that there are legitimate concerns enough to suggest that perhaps we should at least consider the possibility of a public agency, a not-for-profit public agency, stepping into that role. There are a lot of practical considerations in terms of what these different schemes might look like that I think, we need to think carefully through and consider in great detail. But I think all I want to suggest is that the distinction that we're interested in is ultimately one between the moral issues that arise when we're talking about payment and the moral issues that arise when we're talking about profit. If it turns out that a public, not-for-profit agency turns out to be like terrible at securing the plasma supply that we need, and a for-profit agency turns out to be excellent at it, then, like, again, given that that's our goal, right, we are not kind of committed to a particular outcome here, simply raising concerns about allowing a for-profit agency to take control of this, and a not-for-profit agency could certainly do it because there really aren't any good moral arguments against it. A for-profit model that is properly constrained and regulated by a public agency is not necessarily an objectionable one, and may even be advantageous for the reasons that you're suggesting. Maybe it isn't a matter of just saying, yes, we should, or no, we shouldn't license CPR to open any more clinics. Maybe, right, the right discussion to be having is about what sorts of regulations we want to impose on who they can sell that plasma to or what they can do with it, right? So perhaps that's one way we could be thinking about legislation on this issue.
And that is exactly what patients wish would be the focus of this public policy debate. What regulations are necessary to give patients the best of both worlds? Thank you so much, Vida, for taking time to speak with us, and to Chad as well for using your voices to refocus the argument and look for answers in the gray. Thank you for listening, and remember to donate blood or plasma if you're able to do so wherever you are. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast and will join us for our next episode. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me directly at kate@plasmaforlife.org.